Got a few notes here then in case I don't I lose my way.
Speak up.
Yep. Speak up. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Big shout.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, President Brian. I was pleased when Ron asked me to do this because it gives me an opportunity to introduce myself a little better to you and tell you a little bit more about my career and where I came from, because obviously you can see from the accent I'm not an Essex boy, so I thought I'd do that. My career has really been in three phases. I had my early education and training, and then I worked in the UK for a short while after I qualified. And then, being an adventurous soul, I went to Africa, and after Africa I went to Mauritius and worked for 13 years in total in those two countries. And then subsequently I came back to the UK and I worked for British Oxygen Company for the next 25 years in a variety of roles, mainly on the technical side. I'm one of life's fortunate people in that I've been in the right place at the right time on many, many occasions, and for that I'm very grateful to whoever looked after me. I qualified in engineering in 1964 following comprehensive training with the railways. I was trained in the railways, and I was very, very fortunate to, as part of my training, I worked in every single engineering department to do with manufacturing of railway rolling stock. And I spent a little bit of time on the permanent way just to understand how it worked, but mainly to do with engineering and engineering manufacturing. And that training really put me in enormous stead for the rest of my life. I studied higher national diploma, and eventually through a professional institute qualified and finally got my engineering status in 1967. I was very fortunate in that shortly after I qualified the railways had a major reorganisation, and I very quickly got a junior management role looking after the manufacturing of railway rolling stock, particularly tankers, that was becoming much more important in the at that time. And I got very, very good experience. And as soon as I got that job, I got married, which was quite common in those days to marry relatively young. And of course, I was always short of money, so I started teaching engineering just shortly after I qualified at evening classes. And as a side, it's rather interesting to think about evening classes. When I did evening class teaching, they were heavy subjects: commerce, business studies, engineering, all this sort of thing. And I looked at the Havering one just before when I was preparing for this little talk, and it's all soft subjects: flower arranging, dressmaking, and it makes you wonder, because people were able to qualify who missed part of their education. That's all gone, hasn't it? You have to have formal full-time education. It's very difficult to do it through evening classes like this. And that's just as an aside. But during the course of my night school teaching, which I enjoyed, but I did it for the money, and I enjoyed it, I attended a lecture given by the Minister of Overseas Development. Sometimes it's the Ministry of Overseas Development, or the ODA, or the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, depends which government in office. And really the basis of this lecture was to tell people what the British government were doing in the newly independent Commonwealth countries, what they were actually doing to support these countries in terms of overseas aid. And the underlying situation was they were recruiting what they called a corps of specialists, people who could work in the newly independent countries and manage the aid programme, as it were, and make a contribution to the success of the newly independent countries. And I was quite interested in that, because the mortgage was hanging around my neck. I'd got a wife, I'd got, Rochdale is not the nicest place in the world to be based, but even worse than Derby, even worse than Derby, where I spent some time. So, and training in Manchester was it. So I thought I'll have a go at this. So I went down to London, Elland House, Stag Place, and went and had all my interviews and things. And of course, the matter was they offered me a position. I was one of the youngest to join the Corps of Specialists, if not the youngest. And I accepted it and took the position. Quite confident, wasn't bothered, adventurous, didn't know what I was doing, and they said, well, your assignment is to Kenya. We're going to send you to Kenya, and you'll be working in Nairobi, you'll be attached to the university, and this is what we're ready to do. And of course I got my tickets, and I sailed off from the Royal Albert Dock, which some of you remember, on this wonderful white liner, and we sailed down the Thames and into Passengers Green. It was an absolutely wonderful experience. And we sailed off and out we went. And all the posh people, of course, were on one side of the ship, and all the workers were on the other side of the ship. And I came to realise the origin of the word posh, which I'm supposed most of you know, port out, starboard home. And we just made a little bit of a laugh about that in the bar having a beer with us. You know. When we got in the Suez Canal and it was 45 degrees and we were starboard and the sun was shining on your cabin all day without any air conditioning, you soon realised what posh really meant. And it was a very nice trip. It sailed to all the ports you can imagine: Gibraltar, Naples, Port Said, Aden, all these places. Now, just a couple of asides. When we got to Aden, I heard shooting for the first time in my life. I hadn't realised how sheltered my upbringing had been, but I heard shooting for the first time, serious shooting, and the boat could not dock because there was terrorist activity in the crater region. And I remember to this day, because we couldn't dock, the British Army came on board in these launches, and they all came on board and made straight for the bar, of course, and this poor couple were disembarking with 2 children. I never forget this woman's face as she was put on this launch to sail off into Aden to do some kind of service. That stuck with me all my life. I felt so sorry for this poor woman. But we had more light-hearted moments. When we got to Port Said, we decided to spend the last of our money on a trip round Port Said. And we hired a guide, Jimmy McTaggart, who was a fully robed Arab, who had learnt his English from a Scottish regiment. And his choice of phrase was really choice, as you can imagine. And I'll never, well, I'm sure my wife will forget it even less, when he took us to King Farouk's palace and meticulously described in soldier talk what he'd been up to in these palaces. So you can imagine the language, and there was an introduction in my life that she's probably never forgotten. But we eventually arrived in Mombasa after being stuck in the Great Bitter Lakes, which are absolutely roasting in this, just off the Suez. I've never known temperatures like it. It was well in the 40s all the time. We were stuck there in the Bitter Lakes. And then eventually we got to Mombasa. And I had to travel from Mombasa to Nairobi, where my appointment was, by train. And I'm sorry Mike's not here today. It was a bit of a train enthusiast, because this was something special. There is a railway that was called at that time the Lunatic Express. It's well known as the Lunatic Express, because who would be crazy enough to cut a railway from sea level through the escarpment to Kampala at 9,000, over the escarpment at 9,000 feet? Who would be crazy enough to do that but the British? But this permanent way opened up the country forever. It was a fantastic operation, and to see it and to travel on it was one of life's experiences. Likewise, the engines, they were old British engines, 1880, 1890, and they were wood burners. And so every 50 miles, a flipping engine had to stop to take on wood and water. It only went about 10 miles an hour, and everybody would pile off and start cooling it, and then it would set off again. Nobody ever got left because it didn't go fast enough. I could have caught it, never mind. But it was an experience. It took about 20 hours to get to Nairobi. 250 miles took about 20 hours, and eventually got there and went to the High Commission for our briefing. And on a serious note, the British government were deeply committed to making these newly independent countries successful. And it surprised at the time how deep that commitment was, because of course all you heard on the news was bad things, colonial was a bad word, but they were deeply committed, and it was really stressed to us how important it was that we would create an atmosphere where the countries could be successful. And I was very heartened by that when I arrived. The responsibilities were strongly felt. The political situation was deteriorating when I got there. And of course, I think Yaka knows himself, a lot of the key positions in Kenya and in the protectorate like in Uganda were held by expatriates or second and third generation Asians who had gone to this country. So all the key positions were held. There were very few key positions held by Africans. And perhaps the British government should have thought about this a bit earlier, but perhaps the independence came quicker than they anticipated. But most of the key positions were held by expatriates. And of course, the Asians, who were not expatriates, they actually were residents, and they had contributed massively to the country. But of course, the pressures were coming on, and the Mau Mau had formally finished in 1961. It had petered out, but it had formally. But a lot of the British expatriates were leaving, and these held key positions, farmers, telecommunication workers, railway people particularly, were leaving. And there was nobody to fill these key posts. Because I think it's true to say that a lot of the Asians at that time in Nairobi, who ran all the commercial operations, were leaving too, if they could possibly get any money out of the country, they were leaving too. So it was a desperate situation. And the Corps of Specialists' job was to try to fill these vacant positions by training the local African people up to a speed very quickly, express training, and get people up to speed. And my role at the University of Nairobi was to establish a Kenya Polytechnic and get this training underway. The rules were that the examinations had to be conducted by British universities and linked to it, so that if somebody qualified, it wasn't a second-rate qualification, it was actually a genuine qualification that could have been used in the UK. And that was the rules that we had to work to. And of course, we did that reasonably well over a period of years. We were also required to work on projects, because a lot of things like bridges, some of the tank farms in Mombasa, this type of thing, were coming in disrepair, and so all the specialists had to work on these projects. And this was fantastic for me, because I would have never been given this level of responsibility in the UK at that age. And I worked on projects. I'm pleased to say I was in Tanzania recently, and one of the bridges I built was still there. I was not so sure at the time when I built it that it was still there. And I was hoping Raj would be here, because he may have been over it, but I was going to tell him about it. That would have frightened him a bit, wouldn't it? And we did these jobs, and of course it gave this wealth of experience that you'd have never got anywhere else, because you simply had to do it. You were the expert, Corps specialist. Well, it's a tank, you know, and well, I've never done a 150-foot tank before. So what, you know, do it, you know. And we did it. We also had to control the examination, make sure that was done properly, and of course, purchases. I'm not sure about the rules today, Keith, but when I was there, British aid was unconditional. The host country could spend British aid money on anything it liked. It might be designated medical or engineering or roadworks, but they could spend the money as they liked. The difference is that American aid was totally tied. Just as it is in Iraq today, you can only buy American products with American aid. Yeah. And the Japanese, for all their smiling, it was Japanese aid went on Japanese products. The British, and of course there was a lot of abuse of that. People bought machinery in these developing countries that was useless, absolutely useless, too sophisticated, too expensive, no use at all. Wrong units, metric units when the population was educated in inches, they were useless. And our job was to try by influence to get people to buy British equipment and use the aid on British things, but not in any subversive way, just by explaining to people which were there. And we were genuinely instructed to make sure that it was the right information we gave them and the right choices were made. And that was part of the role. The government really believed in the development of these countries, and it persuaded a lot of companies like British Oxygen Company, who I subsequently worked for 25 years, it persuaded them to build air separation units in the country. Companies like Cable and Wireless were there, the banks were there, and BOC invested hundreds of millions of pounds in the Commonwealth with air separation units to try to help this development of these countries. And of course I was very closely working with British Oxygen Company whilst I was there. Fortunately, being in the right place at the right time, I got very good relationships with British Oxygen Company, who served me well later on in life. But we worked hard. We had to do evening work, and we had to go on projects, but it wasn't all work. Kenya was a man's country. I'll be absolutely honest, it was a man's country. I feel sometimes sorry for my wife. There were no luxuries. It was just a big, even though it was better than other places. And of course, I did all sorts of activities that appealed to me. I was part of the Kenya Mountain Rescue Team because mountaineering was starting. It was a lot of people starting to do mountaineering. I climbed Kilimanjaro a number of times, serious climbing in Mount Kenya. And we did hunting. I couldn't kill a fly today, but we used to hunt. You had to get a game license to hunt, and you had to be able to recognise over 100 African animals, their sex and their maturity to hunt. And we did that, but we did it to supplement our wages, because the real hunters were the American millionaires who came to shoot the big five, lion, leopard, elephant, and we shot the plains game that they wanted on their walls and their ranches in Texas, and we got paid for that. And I did a lot of fishing. If there's any fishermen in the room, there was phenomenal fishing there. We went up to Lake Rudolph fishing for perch, and the perch in England was like big ones like that. And of course, this Lake Rudolph had never been fished. The Africans had speared the fish, but it had never been fished with rod and line. First cast, £120 perch. When I show it my pals today, and it's a perch exactly like a perch in England, they can't believe it. They say, can't be. But they were Nile perch. And of course, the second time you put your rod, you got another one, and another one. You know, they'd never been fished. It was absolutely wonderful. Took up golf, and there were plenty of golf courses. But because a lot of the expatriates had left, the expatriate farmers, we were playing 8 medals a month to try and keep these courses going, because they didn't have any members. Some of the courses only had 10 members, so you were playing 8 medals a month. But I also, because I was travelling to a lot of projects out in the roadworks, I decided to learn to fly. If you've ever anybody been to Africa and driven around on the bush roads, then you'll realise what it's like. So I decided to learn to fly. And you know, when people used to go to things, they used to fly along the road for about 3 miles, fly back for 3 miles. If there's nothing coming, land on the road and taxi off, and you're in your location where you wanted to be. So the first lesson, I was exhilarated by that. But of course, it was soon became apparent by the instructor saying to me, well, are you going to do something? That I was totally red and green colourblind. And I said to Alan yesterday, it's not really a qualification for being a pilot. And so my flying career came to an immediate end with an ashen-faced instructor with a glass of whiskey in his hand. So my flying days were very quickly over. There weren't all good times, because in Uganda, and I'm sure you can remember some of these times, we had some difficulty with the examinations. Idi Amin wasn't in power, but he was influencing what was going on at that time, and there was some irregularity with the exams, and I was told to go to Kampala and sort these out at Makere. I had to go there and try and sort it out. And with the innocence of youth, of course, just went up there sorting these problems out. And I saw Idi Amin. I mean, I didn't make any impression on me except he was a big fella. You know, I mean, that's all. I don't remember nothing else about him. But I went up there and I worked in Kampala for a short period of time. And I had some very interesting experiences there, looking at Lake Victoria, which is absolutely huge and impressive if anybody's been there. Never seen a waterway like it. I went to Murchison Falls, which was different from most of the animal sanctuaries. In fact, the Nile runs through, and you've got all the hippopotamuses and the crocodiles there that you don't see so much in Kenya. It's absolutely. But I remember one incident, one of my life experiences. I was taken to a pub outside Kampala, and I was sat down, and the guy said, like a beer, and give me a cup of beer. And at 6:30 precisely, in Bat Valley, 1 million fruit bats take off at the same time. And these fruit bats are this big. And you have never seen anything like it. It took me completely by surprise, didn't tell me, just gave me a beer, whoosh, absolutely phenomenal experience. I don't think you've ever been there, but it's absolutely wonderful. Of course, I did the job, got it done, and it wasn't a big issue, and I was called back to London for a debriefing, and they said to me when I went to Ellen House, Stag Place, they said to me, you've done a really good job, would you like to do another job? I thought, no, not another, I can't handle this, I don't do this. And they said, well, would you like to go to Mauritius? Mauritius, would you like to go to Mauritius? We'd like you to do it. So, of course, I had to think about it for a while, and I think 5 seconds later I said yes. And I went off to Mauritius, and what you should know about Mauritius in these times is Mauritius is a centre of excellence for sugar technology. It still is. It's the second in the world to Baton Rouge in the States, because there was very little tourism, and it was a centre for the excellence for sugar technology. And they wanted to build an engineering faculty, and I was part of the team that built that engineering faculty. Quite different from Africa. The Mauritians liked the British, they respected what we did, and I had an absolutely wonderful time. I was based on a shore base, HMS Mauritius, which we had access to the wardroom, the NAFE, it was completely duty-free, and we didn't have to work too hard. And not anywhere like we'd done in Africa, so it was a wonderful rounding off to the end of my career overseas. I joined the Rotary Club in Mauritius, and we supported the Mauritius Red Cross there. It was our big project. And for my sins, I became Director General of the Mauritius Red Cross for 2 years, because a fellow Rotarian who was the Director General died, and nobody else was daft enough to volunteer, and then I ended up with that job. And we did a wonderful job there. Well, when I'd been there about 5 years, I'd done everything I was supposed to be doing, and the British Oxygen Company Managing Director came out on a visit, like a workation type thing, and he said, look, we're building a brand new state-of-the-art factory at Skelmersdale in Lancashire. You must be homesick. You know, you really, really are this time. I've been 13 years, you must be homesick. And we'll pay you handsomely, and would you like to manage this factory for us? And I thought about it for a while, and all my pals said how crazy I was, but that's what I actually did. And then I spent the next 25 years of my working life as an engineer and a manager for British Oxygen Company. Well, that's been for another day. I hope that's been a little bit interesting, and thank you very much for your attention. Any questions?
Are there any questions of Dave?
Has he?
No questions, you won't see.
Come on, Ron. Come on.
Answer, Ron.
Come on, Ron, think one out.
Thanks, David.
Welcome.
As always on these occasions, it falls to me my pleasure to actually offer a vote of thanks on behalf of the club. And it's been said many times, and I've said it myself, that some of the best talks we ever have are from our own Rotarians, and I think there's no doubt about this one. It was absolutely fascinating. Clearly you've lifted just, I think, the corner of the tablecloth really just to see what's underneath, and I'm sure you've got a lot more tales you can tell us by the sound of it. We'll draw those out of you as time goes. But it's very interesting what you told us, or interesting to me particularly, about the British government's attitude towards the Commonwealth and how it's developing. I've been watching the programme on the television about the Queen doing her tour just after she took power, in fact, and the importance of that, which was perhaps not significant at the time, played its role in the same sort of things you would have been keen to the British government to actually, you know, do the right thing, I suppose. I'm sure that was part of, you were part of it.
I was.
You're the reason for all the problems. But, I'm sure you will agree it was extremely interesting. Obviously some of the experiences you've had, some of us would love to have. So, on behalf of all of us, thank you very much indeed for allowing me.